Welcome to a discussion of making and using compost at home. My name is Phil Radabush. I'm an Extension Master Gardener volunteer in Buncombe County, North Carolina. I've been composting in one way or another for over 30 years and creating compost in a variety of different gardening environments. Today I'll discuss some basic concepts of composting and hopefully get you interested in starting to compost at home. Or if you're already composting, give you some tips to improve your composting efforts. There are notes that accompany this presentation, and you might find it helpful to print those out, which will make it easier for you to follow the flow of information. In addition to the presentation and accompanying notes, these are some additional resources that you might find valuable. The North Carolina Cooperative Extension Service has a guide to managing organic yard waste. You can find that by going to the Cooperative Extension website and searching for AG 467. In addition, the Extension Master Gardeners in Buncombe County maintain 2 compost demonstration sites. One is at the Western North Carolina Farmers Market associated with the Jesse Israel Garden Center, and the other is at the Learning Garden, which is located at the Extension office on Mount Carmel Road, just off Leicester Highway. The 2 demonstration sites have not been active during the pandemic, but once we're beyond the pandemic, you can check on the Buncombe County Extension website to see when Master Gardeners will be at these sites to provide more information for you. With regards to books, there are several that can be very beneficial. The Rodale Institute has published basic guides to composting for over 45 years. Their edition of this book is a great way to get started. Composting for Dummies is written by Kathy Cromwell. She's an Extension Master Gardener and Master Composter located in Arizona. This is a very approachable book and covers composting basics. My favorite book is one by Stu Campbell called Let It Rot. It's very engaging, and I recommend it most often to people that are just beginning in the composting world. The Complete Composting Gardening Guide is a beautifully illustrated book, and it's the most complete compost gardening guide on this list. And finally, there's a pamphlet titled Easy Composters You Can Build by Nick Noyes. It's a really excellent pamphlet that's nicely illustrated and will give you ideas for building a variety of compost bins and other compost systems. So if you're listening to this presentation, there are several assumptions I'm going to make about why you might be interested in composting. First, you want to generate lots of lovely compost so you can grow the best flowers and shrubs, vegetables, and herbs in your neighborhood. Secondly, you want to save some money by producing your own compost to use as a soil amendment. Thirdly, you're concerned about the environment, and you want to do your part to reduce the amount of waste that is sent to our landfills. Fourthly, you follow the philosophy of reduce, reuse, and recycle in other areas of your life, and you want to add composting to that. You want to get more exercise and fresh air and do something outside that is truly productive. Maybe you don't live where local government offers collection of kitchen scraps or food waste for community composting. And finally, you want a family-friendly activity that helps your children or grandchildren understand nature's own recycling process. This last one is actually very important for me. I have twin grandchildren that live near me here in Asheville, and they help me maintain the compost demonstration site at the Jesse Israel Garden Center. They help collect the shredded paper. They help turn the tumbler. I also have vermicomposting with worms in my basement, and they enjoy feeding the worms and taking care of those. So it can become a nice family-friendly activity where you can interact with children or grandchildren in a very positive way. So what is composting? Well, composting comes from 2 Latin words that mean to bring together, which very aptly describes what we do when we create compost. A more extensive definition, and one that I'll use for this presentation, is that composting is the biological decomposition of organic waste by bacteria, fungi, actinomycetes, worms, and other organisms. I like this quote from Stu Campbell: "The modern practice of composting is little more than speeding up and intensifying natural processes." This is a picture that I took during a vacation trip to the Pacific Northwest many years ago. This was a tree that had just fallen the year before, and you can see it's completely covered by moss and is very rapidly beginning the decomposition process. Of course, Pacific Northwest, it's very wet, has a temperate climate, and so things rot or decompose very quickly there. So as an example, with composting, all we're trying to do is to speed up or intensify this natural process that's already occurring. The most important concept I'd like to leave with you today is I want you to think of your compost pile or your compost tumbler, to think of compost as a living organism. And I've got a picture of an animal that I saw on another vacation trip. We took a safari trip to Kenya, and this is an adult lion that we saw during our travels. And you can put any living organism in his place, but I want you to think about what it takes for him to have a good life. And those are the same kind of things we want to create in a compost pile. So what are those? Well, first of all, we know that most living organisms, including this lion, and you could think about you and I as well, we need oxygen. So we need to provide oxygen to our compost pile. We require water. We require a food source, and that food source provides two primary things: a source of carbon, which we use for energy, and a source of nitrogen that we use to make proteins, such as enzymes. So again, in our food source, carbon comes primarily from carbohydrates and fats in our diet. Nitrogen comes from protein in our diet, and the same is true for this lion. And we need to provide both carbon and nitrogen for the living organisms in the compost pile. And then finally, this lion needs some type of habitat or ecosystem in which to live. For you and I, we need oxygen, water, food, and shelter as basic needs. So the bottom line is we want to provide all of these in our compost pile. We want to make the microbes happy, and we're going to make them happy by providing oxygen, water, carbon, nitrogen in some type of habitat or ecosystem. The next important concept is I want you to think about your environment for composting. And I'm going to tell you how my composting environment has changed over the last 40 years or so. In the 1980s, I lived in east central Mississippi. Our house was on 3 acres. It was mostly wooded with a mixture of hardwood trees and some pine trees as well. It started out with just my wife and I, and then we started a family there, had young children. But primarily my environment was dealing with leaves. I had to rake leaves every fall. On 3 acres, I had enough room that I could pile the leaves in large piles at the back of the property or make enclosures to put the leaves. And so my composting environment was primarily dealing with leaves. I had a small amount of material coming out of the kitchen. I only had a small garden, so there weren't many other compostable materials. I then moved to a completely different environment. I moved to eastern Kansas. For most of that time, I lived on a 40-acre property. Most of that property was a tallgrass prairie pasture where it was fenced and we had horses, very few trees. So my composting environment changed considerably. I no longer had leaves to worry about, but I had horse manure to worry about. I had a large vegetable garden. I had a growing family, so I had more material that was coming out of the kitchen. And so a completely different type of environment, but also had a large property, so I was able to build piles in large bins. A few years ago, I moved to Western North Carolina, and changed completely. My wife and I downsized. The children were grown and left home. It was just the two of us again. And we moved to a townhome in a managed community, Biltmore Lake. So I no longer had large property. I no longer had leaves or horse manure to worry about. It was primarily material that was coming out of the kitchen from just two adults. So a completely different environment. And as I'll mention later, I've gone to using vermicomposting or worms as my composting technique. So I want you to think about your own environment at home. Why do you want to compost, and what kind of materials do you want to compost? Because that'll say a lot about how you proceed. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the 6 rules of rot. Those are listed here. We're going to go through each of these in more detail. Basically, the 6 rules of rot will allow you to take organic waste and turn it into that finished compost product. Rule number 1 is mass. And what we want to do is create that environment or that habitat in which the microorganisms that do decomposition will be happy and proliferate. And so for backyard composting, which is our focus today, we generally say that you would like to have a pile or container that contains at least 3 cubic feet of material. So something that's 3 by 3 by 3, maybe as large as 5 by 5 by 5, up to 5 cubic feet, because we need to develop this critical mass. It may be helpful if you have room to stockpile materials and to make a batch of compost all at one time. In essence, bigger is better. So the larger the critical mass you have, the better. However, we still need to have the amount of material that we can physically manage. This is a picture from a local commercial compost venture. And you can see that they have really taken this to their advantage, and they create huge windrows of material to turn into commercial compost. And again, for mass, bigger is better, but we have to think about what is the amount of material that we can physically manage at home. Rule number 2, particle size. So we said with rule number 1, bigger is better. Well, for rule number 2, smaller is better. So the smaller the particle size of the materials that go into your compost, the quicker decomposition will occur. So as an example, newspapers are very good to use in a compost pile, but it'd be a lot better to shred those rather than using the intact paper. Same thing for wood products. Certainly you can use woody material, but the smaller the size, so using, say, sawdust instead of wood particles will hasten the decomposition process. Many of us want to manage leaves that fall off the tree in the fall, and one of the best things you can do with leaves is to go ahead and shred those. There are a variety of backyard shredders, or you could use a lawnmower and run a lawnmower over the leaves multiple times and make windrows. But the more you can break up leaves particle size wise, the more quickly they will decompose in your compost. Rule number 3. Remember, we said that lion or living organisms need a source of carbon and nitrogen. They use carbon as an energy source. Again, they use nitrogen to make proteins. In the parlance or the terminology of composting, we use the term browns and greens. So browns are to connote ingredients that are primary sources of carbon. Greens connotes those ingredients that are good sources of nitrogen. We use those terms because many of the ingredients that supply carbon are brown in color. Those that supply nitrogen are green in color, but again, we'll see that the color can vary. So this shows some good examples of ingredients that we typically put in compost bins or compost containers that are a source of carbon. Probably the most common I've already mentioned are leaves, wood chips, pine needles, straw, woody prunings, dryer lint from your home, sawdust, shredded paper, shredded or torn cardboard. Those are probably the most common sources of carbon. You can see most of those are kind of a brownish color, and hence the term browns. On the other hand, sources of nitrogen include those things that come out of the kitchen, so fruit and vegetable scraps, things that we may dispose of in our vegetable gardens or in our landscapes, so plant clippings. Coffee browns aren't green in color, but are excellent sources of nitrogen. Tea bags, grass clippings, hair, and even crushed eggshells can all be sources of nitrogen. If you read resources about composting in the books, they'll talk about a ideal ratio of carbon to nitrogen. For beginning the composting process, that ideal ratio is about 30 to 1. Ultimately, soil, most highly organic soils, have a ratio of about 10 to 1. So you can see that during the composting process, as the microbes multiply and divide and increase in mass, they're consuming carbon. So the amount of carbon in the compost will go down as the process continues. Here are some examples of the carbon to nitrogen ratio found in different types of ingredients that we might use in a compost bin or a compost pile. Those that are high in carbon, so they have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, would include sawdust and paper and leaves. You can see are about 41. Realize ideally we would like to achieve a ratio of about 30 to 1. So that means that we need to add some type of ingredient that's higher in nitrogen. What this really tells you is that if you're using something like sawdust and paper, we need to use more greens than if we use an ingredient such as dried leaves. So higher nitrogen ingredients include green grass clippings, coffee grounds, and the material that comes out of the kitchen, like vegetable and fruit pairings, are about 20 to 1. And so they're good to add to leaves. And you can see if we take leaves at 40 to 1 and some of these other ingredients at 20 to 1, it's easy to achieve that ideal ratio. And then we have some ingredients, and this is an example here, rabbit manure or rabbit pellets are even higher in nitrogen. We typically will build a pile in what we call the lasagna technique, where we will layer these different ingredients in a pile or in a tumbler. So we want to provide a source of browns, we want to provide a source of greens, and then usually we're going to add a little bit of soil, native soil, or maybe a little bit of compost that we've made previously, because we want a source of these microorganisms to inoculate this mixture of greens and browns. So here are a couple of different diagrams to show you how to do that. It's probably less important to remember the ratios than just to remember the rule of thumb. In general, for most of the ingredients that we're going to use for the compost pile, if we use 2 to 3 parts browns and 1 part greens, we'll typically achieve the ratio that we desire. So don't get hung up on ratios. Just realize we need to provide both browns and greens for the process to be efficient. If your compost pile or the compost tumbler smells, one of the things that we need to do is add more browns or a source of carbon. Let me give you an example of that. My daughter-in-law is a trained culinary person. She went to culinary school, and so she's an excellent cook. I always enjoy going to visit her because I know the food is going to be superb. Well, she had a compost tumbler and she started composting. And when I visited one time, she said, I'm really concerned because my compost tumbler really smells bad and it's attracting lots of flies and other insects. So I went out and looked at it, and primarily what she was doing was using material from the kitchen, so kitchen scraps, and not really adding a source of carbon or browns. They lived in a new subdivision. There weren't very many trees that had been planted, so there weren't really leaves. So what we did is we took some cardboard and shredded it up and put it in the tumbler, and they bought a bale of straw. Every time she went out with her compost pail and dumped it in the tumbler, then she would add about twice as much straw to that as a source of browns. That really got the process back into balance, and within a couple of weeks, she was making better compost. The smell went away, and the insects were no longer attracted to that. So just an example of how we need both a source of carbon and a source of nitrogen for our pile. I have a t-shirt that says this: my compost doesn't stink. Again, if we get carbon and nitrogen in the appropriate ratios, we won't have that problem. Rule number 4, all living organisms need a source of water or moisture. So water is a very important part of the decomposition process. In general, we would like the pile to have about 50% moisture, which means that it's moist but not wet. The rule of thumb is that if you take up some of the compost material and it feels damp like a sponge that's been wrung out, that's the best level of moisture to maintain the process. Rule number 5 is oxygen. Again, think of that line, think about you and I. We need oxygen to survive, and most of the microorganisms will proliferate and be most efficient if they are living in an aerobic or oxygen containing environment. Now, certainly decomposition will happen anaerobically or in the absence of oxygen, but oftentimes that's where we will get the bad smell and the process is very inefficient. On the other hand, if it's going on aerobically, there'll be no bad odors and the microbes will work more quickly. So what's an example of anaerobic decomposition? Well, think about taking some fresh grass clippings right after you've mowed your yard. If you rake those up and put those in a plastic bag, it might be a clear plastic bag, it might be a black plastic bag, close it up tight, put it out on your drive in the hot summer sun for 3 or 4 or 5 days. If you open up that plastic bag, you're going to have a stinky, yucky mess. And that's an example of decomposition that has occurred in an anaerobic environment. So how do we achieve oxygen concentrations in the compost? Well, certainly this is one advantage of tumblers, whether you have a tumbler that's on a stand or one that's on the ground. If you tumble that every day and shift the materials around, you'll get oxygen within the compost material. Certainly, if we have a pile, we can physically turn that pile with a pitchfork or some other implement. Again, here's where mass comes into effect. We don't want a pile that's so large that we can't physically manage it. I showed you this picture earlier of a commercial company that's producing compost, and they have huge compost piles. They still need to do the same thing. They want to add oxygen to that pile. In this case, they're having to use either a front loader or a digger to literally physically turn that large pile. So commercial ventures have to do the same thing that we do as a backyard compost. And finally, there are some instruments like this that have sort of wings that come out when you push it into the pile. You can push it into the bottom of a large pile, pull it out, the wings expand, and basically make areas where air can accumulate. And the final rule, number 6, is time. We need to make a decision of whether we are going to use an active composting process or what I call a passive process. And I've done composting both ways. Active or the fast process, literally you can start with a pile of materials, and if you have followed the other rules, if you've gotten your carbon to nitrogen ratio just right, if you've kept it moist, if you've aerated it, literally you can create compost in as little as 2 to 6 months. And the pile actually gets hot. And you can see the steam here that's coming off the pile. This pile is not burning. This is heat that's being released because of all the microbial activity and decomposition that's occurring within that pile. On the other hand, you can take the slow approach or passive approach, and I've done this as well. It may take you as long as 6 to 24 months or almost 2 years to create compost. The pile stays cold, but in this case, we don't worry about it so much. We don't worry about whether we've gotten the ideal carbon to nitrogen ratio. We don't really care about whether we've got all the other attributes that we've talked about. We basically just create a pile and let nature take its course. Both methods can be very successful. The advantage of hot composting is literally within 6 to 8 weeks, you can have a finished compost. It's really the only method to destroy weed seeds. The temperature in the pile needs to reach at least 140 degrees and maintain there for a period of time to destroy weed seeds. So if weed seeds have crept into your pile in the cold composting type, they will usually survive, and you're going to have problems with pests. The cold advantage is it's easy to do. You just need to build a container or build a pile. So it's easy to start, requires less work. You don't worry about turning it. You may have more pest problems, animals that want to come by and feed on material that's in your pile, but it is really the best method to use if you want to encourage worms. So let me tell you a little story about the Australian brush turkey. I became familiar with this bird when I visited Australia on a business trip. You see a picture of the brush turkey here. It resembles our wild turkey in that it doesn't have any feathers on its head and neck. It's about the same size as our wild turkey, but it's only very vaguely related to our turkey, but looks very similar. This is what the Australian brush turkey does. If you're a male turkey, you build a huge mound as pictured here. These can be anywhere from 3 to 4 feet high. I saw them that were 6 to 8 feet long, and basically use a combination of browns and greens. The brush turkey knows to bring in leaves and sticks, but they also use green leaves and lichens also as greens. So they're using both browns and greens to create this large pile, because this is where the female brush turkey is going to lay her eggs. So he builds the mound, and then he begins courting the female brush turkeys, and the bigger and better the mound, the more likely that a female is going to mate with him. Once they mate, they dig a hole and they lay the eggs, and literally this is a compost pile. It gets warm, and as it warms up, as composting is occurring, then that incubates the eggs. But the brush turkey is very concerned about the temperature of the pile. And that's because the target temperature in the pile will make a difference on what gender the chicks are when they are born. So the brush turkey targets a temperature of about 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. If it's cooler than that, then most of the eggs that hatch will be male chicks. And if it's warmer than that, most of the chicks will be female. So they can really determine the sex or gender of the chicks depending on the temperature of the pile. During the incubation process, they will dig holes in the pile and stick their entire front end into that. Scientists aren't real sure how they are determining the temperature of the pile. It appears that they have some temperature sensitive organelles either in their mouth or in their nose, and they can tell very closely what the temperature is. Then they can either increase the temperature by adding green material, or they can decrease the temperature by adding brown material, so they can regulate the compost pile. They are very effective at doing this. So what can we learn from that? Well, one thing we can do is if you're doing warm or active or hot composting, it'd probably be helpful to have this instrument, which is a compost thermometer. So if we have a pile that's heating up, we can take the thermometer, stick it into the pile, and tell exactly what the temperature is, and watch the temperature go up or down, or we can change our composting methods on whether we want a hot or a cold process. I think most of us aren't going to dig a hole and stick our heads in it, so we're going to use the thermometer instead of what the brush turkey does. So that's composting made easy. It's pretty simple. We need a source of carbon, which are browns. We need a source of nitrogen, which are greens. We need air or oxygen. We need water. We need a critical mass that creates habitat. And again, the smaller the size of materials that we put in the pile, or in the bin or in the tumbler, the more quickly composting will occur. So let's talk a little bit about leaves. This is the process that I used in Mississippi for many years because, again, I had primarily leaves to deal with as a compost ingredient. And we know if we go out in nature that leaves fall off the trees and they accumulate on the ground, but we know decomposition is occurring because the leaves don't pile up and become several feet in thickness. So we can create what's called leaf mold, and we use the same concepts that we've talked about before. We can create a large leaf pile, or we can build bins or containers to hold the leaves. The leaves will decompose much more quickly if they're shredded. We also want to water the pile, so keep it moist but not wet. We want to turn it to, again, add oxygen or air to the pile. We can then inoculate this with a little bit of greens or a nitrogen source. We usually do that with a fertilizer. So examples of fertilizers that you can sprinkle over your pile of leaves, you can use a typical lawn fertilizer. They're usually around 25 to 30% nitrogen. So we can just sprinkle a typical lawn fertilizer over the top. If you want to go more natural or organic, you can use soybean meal, cottonseed meal, corn gluten meal. These are all about 6 to 9% nitrogen, but still will be very effective at jump-starting the decomposition process. You don't have to add greens or a fertilizer source to make leaf mold, but it can be helpful. So what kind of containers can we use for composting? First of all, it's important to look at your compost environment and look at the types of materials that you'll want to be composting and how much space is available for you to create a compost bin, a compost pile, or a tumbler. So think about cost. Many tumblers, as an example, may cost as much as $200 or $300, and there's certainly less expensive ways to get started. Again, what is the volume of materials that you are going to compost? What is your space that is available? And for many years, I had either 3 acres or 40 acres to use, so I had lots of usable space. Currently, I live in a townhome, and so the space is very limited. What is your climate? What local restrictions might apply to creating bins? Do you have any pests that might bother your compost pile? I think one of the easiest ways to get started with composting is to use wood pallets. They're relatively inexpensive. You can generally purchase pallets for about $3 a piece from a variety of local sources. So for less than $20, you can create either a single bin, 2 or 3 bin system. Another simple way to get started is simply with straw bales, and you can create, again, 1, 2, or 3 bins with the straw bales. Not only will they help you create your environment, but you can use some of the materials for browns if you want. I mentioned this pamphlet earlier, this Easy Composters You Can Build by Nick Noyes. It's about $4. It's nicely illustrated, and he has literally dozens and dozens of examples and descriptions of materials that you need to build different types of compost bins. And so if you're not real sure which direction to go, this is a good place to start. So when is it finished? Now, typically we say if you have a compost pile or bin, it's when individual ingredients are no longer recognized, and you'll get a very characteristic material that's light and fluffy, kind of dark in color, and has what we typically call an earthy smell. And that earthy smell is coming from the actinomycete organisms that are very important in the decomposition process. You may also find that it's helpful to sift your compost. This is a sifter that was built by one of our extension master gardeners, and we used at our demonstration site at the Learning Garden. And you can see here we just put it over a wheelbarrow, and we've used some hardware cloth and a frame, and we're sifting out the larger woody material and just letting the finished compost accumulate in the wheelbarrow. And again, we can take that woody material and incorporate it back into our compost pile. Now, there are other ways to compost, and I've used these methods as well. Again, depending on how much area you have available. But for many years, I had a large vegetable garden, and about a third of the garden I would keep fallow every year and not use. And I would create what's called a trench compost. So I would use my rototiller, dig a trench, and then in that trench, I would basically do the same type of lasagna technique. I'd put in layers of leaves or other browns, layers of greens, and then cover that with a little bit of soil. And over time, that trench would completely fill up. Then that trench is where I would plant some of my vegetables in the garden the next year. You can also simply do what's called pit composting. Depending on your space, what I would do is go out to my vegetable garden, again, the area that was fallow and I wasn't actively growing, and I would dig a hole, put materials in there. This is actually a good way to deal with coffee grounds. So you can take large volumes of coffee grounds, dig a hole, put the coffee grounds in there, fill it back up. So both trench and pit composting are alternative techniques to using an established bin or tumbler. You can also make what I call compost smoothies. This is how I like to compost my eggshells. I've just got a bag in my freezer and I keep the eggshells until I have a large quantity. Then I pull out my blender and I put in some of my vegetable and fruit scraps and the eggshells and a little bit of water and blend that up. And then you can either dump that on the compost pile that you've created or dig a pit and put your compost smoothie in the ground. And I think that's a really good way to manage eggshells. And then there's vermicomposting. This is what I've gone to after almost 40 years of having lots of property and lots of space to compost. As I said, I now live in a townhome, so I have limited space. It's just my wife and I, so it's just the materials that are coming out of the kitchen. And so I've gone to vermicomposting or using worms and created a worm bin for composting in my basement. It requires little space. You do it indoors, so basically at room temperatures. It's a really excellent soil amendment. As I said earlier, it's kid friendly. My grandkids love to come over and feed and look at the worms, and really requires very little physical labor comparing having to manage a large pile or a large bin. You'll find different calculations for how many worms you will need. They basically said you need about a pound of worms, which are typically about 1,000 red wigglers per square foot of surface area. You can take a plastic container and make a bin. And these blue plastic containers that are pictured here are what I have in my basement. Typically, about a pound of worms will consume actively about 2 pounds of garbage per week. If you're interested in vermicomposting, it's good to know that North Carolina State University has one of the world's foremost authorities on vermicomposting. Her name is Rhonda Sherman. She maintains a website called worms.ncsu.edu, and she's also published a brochure called Worms Can Recycle Your Garbage. And you can find that by going out to the Cooperative Extension website and searching for AG 473-18. And there are also a couple of good books. One's called The Worm Book, and the other one is called Worms Eat My Garbage. And those are listed in the composting resources in your handout as well. There are compost services that are available in Asheville. They have limited service outside of the city limits. These are also listed in your notes or handouts as well. Finally, you need to establish your own composting style. As I said initially, look at your compost environment. How much space do you have? What types of materials do you want to compost? And then establish your own style. And I've used all of these over the years, depending on my environment. You can make leaf mold. You can do hot or quick processing if you do everything exactly right. You can do the cold or passive composting. You can use worms. You can use trenches or pits. So there are a variety of different composting styles. And the first thing you need to do is evaluate your own situation and decide what works best for you. I've used all of these techniques, and all of them can be successful. So what are the benefits of compost? Well, I like this ancient quote, 1 acre well composted is worth 3 acres. And so these are the ways that we can use compost in our garden or landscape. Certainly many of us deal with heavy clay soils, and so it will help amend those heavy clay soils. It will improve what we call tilth, which is the physical characteristics of the soil, and improve drainage, may improve absorbency of nutrients and water, reduces water runoff. It only slightly increases fertility, and we'll talk about that again here in a moment. And very importantly, it will increase beneficial soil microbes. I like to say that compost is not a plant fertilizer. Compost is a soil fertilizer. So the nutrient levels, if we look at finished compost, N, P, and K, and most fertilizers will list that. N is nitrogen, P is phosphorus or phosphate, K is potash or potassium. And many of our fertilizers will have very high numbers. Compost is about 1, 1, 1. So it really isn't a good plant fertilizer, but it's an excellent soil fertilizer. And by that I mean we're helping to feed the rhizosphere, which are all those microorganisms that exist in the soil. And most of our plants establish beneficial symbiotic relationships with soil microbes. So think of compost as fertilizing the soil, and then from that the plants will benefit. One example of that is you can do the Willett-Rott soil test. I learned about this from Dr. Rhonda Yankee. She was one of my instructors when I was a master gardener student in the state of Kansas. And this shows you an example of what you can do at home. You can take some actual filter paper that you would use in a laboratory, or you can use paper coffee filters. Place in the bottom of a flat covered dish. Fill the dish with moist soil. Again, you want it to be moist, not wet. You can add a little bit more water if you want. And then incubate it and watch what happens. If you have lots of microbes, decomposing microbes in your sample, it's going to actively decompose, if you will, chew up that filter paper. And so the examples she showed here were examples that were incubated for a week at 95 degrees. In the lower right corner, you can see this is soil from a typical farmer's field of a row crop. You can see there's very little destruction of the filter paper. The one in the middle is from a typical vegetable garden. You can see there are a little bit of black flecks, but then look at the worm compost on the left. You can see that within a week, already the filter paper is being decomposed or chewed up by the microorganisms. And that's what we would like to see in good, healthy soil. Just an example of how compost is a soil fertilizer, not really a plant fertilizer. So how do we use it? Well, we can incorporate it in lawns either before planting, or you can spread light layers over the lawn and water or let natural rain, let that go into the soil. When we plant trees or shrubs, we can use it as a mulch, or we can incorporate that in the soil when we plant trees or shrubs. And anywhere in the garden, incorporate it at planting or using as a top dressing around the plants. I like to use it in containers. Many of the potting mixes that we purchase are sterile, and that's good because that won't be bringing in any pathogens or microbes that may infect our plants. But on the other hand, as I said, most of our plants need to establish symbiotic relationships with beneficial microbes in the soil, and we can provide that with compost. So we can take containers, take about 2/3 potting mix, about 1/3 compost, and that will help that situation. What about compost troubleshooting? Well, as I mentioned earlier, if you have that rotten odor or that ammonia odor, which is what my daughter-in-law was dealing with, there's two things we can do: add browns or turn the pile. In other words, add oxygen or air to the pile. If we're trying to do active or hot composting, and we use a thermometer and it shows very low temperatures, we can either add greens, add water, increase the size of the mass, or turn the pile and aerate. So think of all those things that those living organisms need. If we have pests that are visiting it, we need to make sure to remove meat or fatty foods that we shouldn't have put in the pile to begin with, and we can also cover those with a thick layer of browns. One of the pests we deal with in the mountains are bears. At least in our experience as master gardeners, bears usually aren't a problem in the compost pile unless they're being attracted by other things, unless they're being attracted by pet food that's left outside or garbage that's left out or bird feeders. As long as you don't attract the bears to begin with, most of the bears are not going to be attracted to a well-managed compost pile. Materials not to compost. We certainly don't want to take materials from our garden or landscape that are diseased, may have fungal, bacterial, or other insect pests, and put those in the compost pile because they may be retained there. A large woody material, feces from dogs and cats, or other carnivores and omnivores should not be used. Styrofoam, meats, fat material, walnuts, and fabric sheets that you may use in your dryer should not be put in the compost. Another way to use compost is to make compost tea. The simple plan is to take 1 part compost and about 5 to 10 parts water and just mix it together and use that as a drench around plants. Some people advocate putting that directly on the plants themselves. You can actually buy compost tea bags and make large volumes in 5 or 10 gallon buckets. Some people also recommend activated compost tea. That's by taking one of these bags with compost, putting it in a 5-gallon bucket, and actively aerating it, and that will increase the number of microorganisms, and then use that as a drench. And again, my favorite author, Stu Campbell, I like this as a reminder, no matter what you do, no matter how many mistakes you make, you are still probably going to come up with reasonably good, usable compost. So we're going to finish with a quiz. You can do this mentally as I go along, but hopefully this will reemphasize some of the key learnings from this presentation. Compost means, in other words, what do the Latin words mean? To bring together. Name the 6 rules of rot. These are the 6 things we need to focus on to be successful at making compost. Give you a minute to think about those. So we need a critical mass, larger the better. Particle size, smaller the better. We need a source of energy, which is carbon, source of nitrogen, water, oxygen, and then time. Browns, greens, air, water, and a critical mass or habitat. If the compost pile or container smells, what are 2 things you can do? As we said, add browns and aerate. Name 2 items to not put in the compost pile. Here's some example: dog feces or cat feces, walnuts, meat or fat, diseased plants, styrofoam, dryer sheets. And finally, if the Australian blank can compost, then so can you. So there's our hero, the Australian brush turkey. And again, if the Australian brush turkey can create a compost pile and maintain it successfully, then certainly you can do the same. If you need help about composting or any other gardening question, there is a garden helpline in Buncombe County that's available. You see the phone number here. It's also very easy to email buncomemg@gmail.com. The nice thing there, you can send pictures of plant problems or pests or plant identification, and you can be helped. We also have people available to answer the phone Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, March through October. I also encourage you that after the pandemic, when we start staffing the demonstration sites at the Learning Garden and at the Western North Carolina Farmers Market, you can stop by there and talk to master gardeners specifically about composting questions. Thanks for joining us. Hope you've learned something today, and happy gardening in the months and years ahead.